True Detective is a crime drama that follows Louisiana detectives Rust Cohle and Marty Hart as they investigate the gruesome and almost theatrical murder of Dora Lane. This case leads them down a years-long rabbit hole, during which we witness the detectives' individual idiosyncrasies and how they mesh, or more often, clash with each other. Marty's life is not simple by any means, but certainly more relatable, and you get the sense that this is how he wants people to view him. Marty is far more pro-social, and is willing to do what's necessary to be amicable, relatable, and respected.
Which type were you?
Oh, I was just a regular type dude with a big-ass dick.
However, Marty is selective about which societal rules he follows, creating a sort of paradox in his character. For example, he always alludes to being a Christian, like many people in his community, but he doesn't seem fully committed to the faith. He appears to value Christianity more for its communal benefits.
I mean, can you imagine if people didn't believe what things they'd get up to?
And shares many of its values, such as the sanctity of marriage. But maybe fidelity isn't a value he deems worthy enough.
How good is cake if you can't eat it?
Rust could not be more opposite. Where Marty seeks acceptance and strives to maintain a semblance of normalcy, even if that means lying, Rust is unflinchingly honest, often brutally so, and harbors a deep contempt for the superficiality he perceives in others. Unlike Marty, who, perhaps like a lot of us, might bend the truth when it suits him for the sake of social cohesion,
The common good.
Rust has little interest in any form of social niceties. Instead, he operates on a level of raw, unfiltered realism, which often alienates those around him. While Marty steers clear of deep introspection, not due to a lack of intelligence, but rather from his desire to fit in, as mentioned earlier, Rust is profoundly introspective, almost to a debilitating extent, and this often pushes people away.
You get any sleep last night?
I don't sleep. I just dream.
Arthur Schopenhauer's concept of the will is perhaps his greatest gift to philosophy, and I think it marks a shift in all of Western thought. Schopenhauer saw the will as the irrational, blind, instinctual force that drives most, if not all, human behavior. Your sense of bodily self-preservation, your sexual desire, your emotions, and most of your so-called rational choices. This idea challenged the traditional emphasis on reason, and the idea that we are such rational beings. Think of it as an early idea of the subconscious mind. Here, Schopenhauer adds a frustrating lack of control to the human consciousness, which shouldn't be unfamiliar to you if you've read Nietzsche or Freud. If you've watched my Lighthouse video, you can see how Freud's idea of the id clearly takes its inspiration from Schopenhauer's idea of the will. Rust seems to subscribe to this idea wholeheartedly, although he calls it his programming.
What's the point of getting out of bed in the morning?
I tell myself I bear witness. The real answer is that it's obviously my programming. And I lack the constitution for suicide.
But before that, he says,
I think human consciousness was a tragic misstep in evolution. We became too self-aware. Nature created an aspect of nature separate from itself. We are creatures that should not exist by natural law.
When Rust says that human consciousness is a tragic misstep, he's essentially saying that we unfortunately became aware of the futility of life and its many, many sufferings, which are the only guaranteed outcome of the act of living. After all, Schopenhauer tells us that life is a constant process of suffering. Every satisfaction is only a pain subdued, and with every wish fulfilled, another will predictably arise. So life, the will, by itself, only serves to bring us suffering. It's the root of all suffering, as it perpetuates the constant desire and dissatisfaction, which must then be satiated, simply for all of it to happen again and again. And by gaining this consciousness, we simply become painfully aware of this.
Well, that sounds god-fucking awful, Rust.
Rust's remark that humans are creatures that should not exist by natural law ties into Schopenhauer's deep pessimism about life itself. Rust is making a moral evaluation of all life on Earth, and is essentially saying, we are a crime committed onto nature's order. And Schopenhauer seems to agree. He tells us, if life, the craving for which is the very essence of our being, were possessed of any positive intrinsic value, there would be no such thing as boredom. Existence would be a constant satisfaction to us, but of course, it isn't. If the will is the root of all suffering, then should we deny the will to live? Both Schopenhauer and Rust recognize the urge to commit suicide as a response to suffering, but they see this as ultimately blocked by the underlying will, or in Rust's case, programming. For Schopenhauer, suicide is an attempt to escape suffering, yet paradoxically, it is also an expression of the will. So the will includes the will to minimize suffering, which can lead to a desire for death, but this desire ultimately comes back around and is then countered by the will itself, as it's responsible for our self-preservation. This is why Schopenhauer finds those who manage to commit suicide to be extremely honorable and praiseworthy, and why I think Rust says, quite disheartedly, that he lacks the constitution for suicide.
And I lack the constitution for suicide.
But Schopenhauer is even more pessimistic, viewing suicide as futile because it doesn't actually address the underlying problem of suffering. It merely ends the individual's experience of it. His key argument here is that suicide cannot be a true escape because it targets the individual, not the deeper cause of suffering, which is the will itself. So Schopenhauer even denies us the easy way out. Schopenhauer tells us suicide may also be regarded as an experiment, a question which man puts to nature, trying to force her to an answer. The question is this: what change will death produce in a man's existence and in his insight into the nature of things? It is a clumsy experiment to make, for it involves the destruction of the very consciousness which puts the question and awaits the answer. Like Rust, he accepts no half measures, no half truths. This is your life, and you must confront this head on. So how do we deny the will, or the programming, and make some sense of this suffering, make it bearable at least? Schopenhauer's answer lies in asceticism. Asceticism, very basically, is the deliberate renunciation of desires and pleasures. He saw the will as an irrational blind force driving all beings to seek satisfaction of desires, leading to the constant striving, pain, and suffering. Asceticism, therefore, is the correct denial of this will, an attempt to escape the cycle of desire and suffering by rejecting the paradox entirely. As you've probably realized, Schopenhauer was greatly influenced by Eastern philosophies, particularly Buddhism and Hinduism, which also emphasize the renunciation of desires to overcome suffering. But while watching the show, you might have noticed Rust seems to live an ascetic life, at least to some extent, denying himself pleasures, happiness, and love.
You should have held on to your woman. Getting laid was good for you.
Goddamn. You moron.
His room is completely bare, its only notable feature being a wooden cross on the wall, a symbol of Jesus' sacrifice and extreme suffering, which Rust uses as a form of meditation.
What do you got the cross for in your apartment?
It's a form of meditation.
How's that?
I contemplate the moment in the garden, the idea of allowing your own crucifixion.
And Schopenhauer tells us the inmost kernel of Christianity is the truth that suffering, the cross, is the real end and object of life. When his room isn't empty, it's filled with evidence of others' suffering, particularly young women, which undoubtedly brings to mind memories of his deceased daughter. We can assume he contemplates these things for hours, alone. And of course he's alone, for Schopenhauer tells us a man can be himself only so long as he is alone, and if he does not love solitude, he will not love freedom, for it is only when he is alone that he is truly free.
All your life, not all your love, all your hate, all your memory, all your pain, it was all the same thing. It was all the same dream, a dream that you had inside a locked room. A dream about being a person.
So, as we talked about before, Schopenhauer believed that our perception of reality is completely shaped by the will, which drives us to continually strive and suffer. So in this sense, life can be seen as a kind of dream, an illusory experience dominated by the desires and suffering, which are imposed by the will. This is what I believe Rust means when he talks about life being a dream you had inside a locked room. And the locked room part, I think, gives it its final pessimistic ingredient, representing the inescapable nature of this human condition. When Rust says that all your life, all your love, all your hate, all your memory, and all your pain are all the same thing, to me that tracks very well with Schopenhauer's philosophy. Love, hate, pleasure, pain, and whatever else psychological state you might find yourself in, looking at the bigger picture, are not that distinct or separate. They are all just expressions of the will, which, as we've established, ultimately leads to suffering. It's for this reason that Rust believes the dead bodies he sees ultimately welcomed death.
You look in her eyes, even in a picture, Doesn't matter if they're dead or alive. You can still read them. And you know what you see? They welcomed it. Not at first, but right there in the last instant. It's an unmistakable relief.
As Schopenhauer tells us, death is the great opportunity, no longer to be I. Also, the idea that time is a flat circle is shared multiple times throughout the show.
Someone once told me time is a flat circle.
Now, this idea is most likely a reference to Nietzsche's eternal recurrence. Nietzsche's concept of eternal recurrence is the idea that the universe and all events within it are eternally recurring. Everything that has happened will happen again, indefinitely. This idea is not just a metaphysical hypothesis, but here he is also challenging us, the reader, directly, a sort of test of one's attitude towards life. Nietzsche saw this test as a way to affirm life in its entirety, despite its suffering and hardships. For Nietzsche, the ideal response is amor fati, the love of fate. Embrace all aspects of life, both good and bad, as necessary and valuable. This idea is central to his philosophy of life affirmation and the overcoming of nihilism. Rust, however, is a pessimist, so his interpretation of this Nietzschean idea will resemble more how Schopenhauer would interpret it. He talks about these severely abused children and says,
Everything we've ever done or will do, we're gonna do over and over and over again. And that little boy and that little girl, they're gonna be in that room again. And again. And again. Forever.
Where Nietzsche saw the eternal recurrence as a call to affirm life, Rust rejects this life-affirming philosophy. Instead, he views the concept as a confirmation of life's inherent futility. For Rust, the idea that time is a flat circle doesn't inspire any love of fate, but rather a resignation to the endless cycle of suffering. If the ultimate purpose of the will, as Schopenhauer argued, is to produce suffering, then time being a flat circle makes this suffering eternal and recurring. Rust's interpretation shows his belief in the inherent tragedy of existence, and of our unfortunate conscious awareness of it.
Why should I live in history, huh? I don't want to know anything anymore. This is a world where nothing is solved.
Now, this could very well be Rust showcasing a form of suicidal ideation, but it most likely represents his disillusionment with the very notion of human progress or meaningful change, or any sort of meaning, I guess. If the will has been this way, and will continue to be this way, then any outside forces who attempt any sort of betterment will be nothing more than illusions. No matter how much you strive or struggle, the grip of the will remains. You can alter your material circumstances, chase after new goals, seek personal transformation, but it's all just useless. The essence of your being is tethered to an unending cycle of desire and suffering. Your psyche, despite any superficial changes, will not escape this relentless drive. Every effort you make, every attempt to escape your suffering, is nothing more than pathetic. The will ensures that your deepest struggles remain unsolved. Your true self remains trapped, and the cycle of dissatisfaction continues. You can't escape the will, nor can you escape the constant churn of your inner self. All you're left with is the harsh reality that no matter what you do, you are only creating a perpetually changing present. Now I leave you with an option. Does Rust act as if there is no meaning, or does he act as if everything is painfully meaningful?
I can be hard to live with. I don't mean to, but I can be critical. Sometimes I think I'm just not good for people. You know, that's not good for them to be around me. You know, I wear them down. You know, they get unhappy.
I